Sometimes the people we dismiss as broken are the ones who see what we cannot. Sometimes wisdom looks like madness until it saves your life. In 1897, Millstone Valley turned its back on 80-year-old Jebediah Cole, watching him haul granite and fell giant redwoods alone in the wilderness. They called him insane. They laughed as he disappeared into the forest day after day, building something no one understood. 5 years of mockery, 5 years of isolation. Then came the Great Fire of 1902. What did this elderly cowboy build that would shock the entire town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from right now in the comments below. And if this story truly touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you that will absolutely leave you speechless. The spring of 1897 arrived in Millstone Valley, the way it always did, with melting snow turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud, and the promise of another season of hard work etched into every lined face. The valley sat nestled between two mountain ranges in Northern California, a place where the redwoods grew so tall they seemed to hold up the sky itself, and where men and women built their lives with calloused hands and stubborn hope. Jebediah Cole had lived in this valley for 52 years. He'd arrived as a young man of 28, with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and dreams of building something lasting. Over the decades, he'd done exactly that. His ranch sprawled across 300 acres of prime grazing land, his cattle bearing his brand, his name spoken with respect at town meetings and church gatherings. He'd buried his wife, Margaret, 12 years earlier, a loss that had carved something permanent from his chest. They'd never had children, a quiet sorrow they'd shared in the privacy of their bedroom but never discussed in public. Now, at 80 years old, Jebediah should have been sitting on his porch, watching younger men do the work while he offered advice and told stories. That's what everyone expected. That's what made sense. Instead, on a clear morning in April, Jebediah Cole loaded his wagon with rope, an axe, a water barrel, and his grandfather's leather journal, the one with the cracked spine and pages yellowed by time and weather. He climbed onto the wagon seat with the slow deliberation of a man whose joints remembered every fall from a horse, every winter spent mending fence lines in the freezing rain, every summer of hauling hay bales in the blistering heat. His nearest neighbor, Thomas Garrett, watched from his own property line, shaking his head. Thomas was 65, a relative youngster by comparison, with a thick gray beard and shoulders that still carried muscle beneath his flannel shirt. "Jeb," Thomas called out, walking closer. "Where are you heading so early?" Jebediah turned, his face weathered like old leather, but his eyes clear and sharp as broken glass. "Got work to do, Tom." "Work?" Thomas frowned, glancing at the wagon's contents. "What kind of work needs an axe and that much rope?" "The kind that needs doing." Jebediah's voice carried the gravelly texture of a man who'd spent decades giving orders and expecting them to be followed. Not harsh, but final. Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice even though no one else was around. "Folks in town are worried about you. Ever since Margaret passed, you've been different, more withdrawn. And now this, heading off into the hills by yourself at your age. I'm not asking for worry, Tom. I'm asking for time." "Time for what?" Jebediah looked at his neighbor for a long moment, weighing something internal. "You remember the dry year of 83, when the creek ran low and the grass turned brown by June? Of course, lost 30 head of cattle that summer. You remember what came after? The wet winter that followed and then the fire season of 84? Thomas nodded slowly. "Lightning strike up on Eagle Ridge. Burned for 3 days before the rain came. Weather has patterns, Tom. Most folks see the day in front of them. Some see the season. But if you watch long enough, you see the cycles, the long rhythms." Jebediah tapped the leather journal on the seat beside him. "My grandfather kept records. 50 years of weather, written down every single day. Temperature, wind direction, rain, drought, everything. He passed it to my father, who kept it going. Now it's mine." Thomas waited, sensing there was more. "We're entering a dry cycle, Tom. Not just one summer, years of it. And when the land gets dry enough for long enough, fire doesn't just burn, it explodes, sweeps through like judgment itself. You can't know that for certain." "Can't I?" Jebediah's eyes held something that made Thomas uncomfortable: absolute certainty. I've been watching the patterns for 40 years, checking them against my grandfather's notes. The signs are all there if you know how to read them. Thomas shifted his weight. So what are you planning to do? You can't stop a fire. No, Jebediah agreed. But I can prepare for one. He snapped the reins, and his horse started forward, leaving Thomas standing in the road with questions forming in his mind that he wouldn't voice until much later, when it would have been too late to matter. The town of Millstone consisted of one main street with businesses on either side. A general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other establishments that served the ranchers and farmers scattered throughout the valley. The population hovered around 200 souls, most of them hard-working people who'd carved out livings from the unforgiving land. Sarah Fletcher ran the general store, a widow in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She'd known Jebediah since he first arrived in the valley, had sold him supplies for 5 decades, and considered herself entitled to speak her mind. When Jebediah walked in that afternoon to purchase 30 feet of chain and a new splitting maul, she didn't hesitate. "Jebediah Cole, what in heaven's name are you doing with all this equipment?" She crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "Tom Garrett stopped by earlier. Said you were talking nonsense about weather patterns and fire. Tom talks too much. Tom's worried. We all are." Her voice softened slightly. "You've been different since Margaret. We understand grief, Jeb. We do. But this, whatever you're planning, it's not healthy. You should be resting, enjoying your years, not hauling equipment into the wilderness like a man half your age." Jebediah counted out coins onto the counter. "Exact change. I appreciate the concern, Sarah. Truly. But what I'm doing needs to be done." "What needs to be done? Building what? For what purpose?" He met her gaze steadily. "Survival." The word hung in the air between them like something physical. Sarah's expression shifted from frustration to confusion. Survival from what? From what's coming. Before she could respond, the door opened and Marcus Webb walked in. Marcus served as the town's unofficial mayor, a role he'd taken on through sheer force of personality rather than any formal election. He was 50 years old, prosperous, and convinced of his own importance. "Jebediah," Marcus said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a man trying to sound reasonable. "Just the man I wanted to see. Got a minute?" Jebediah picked up his chain and maul. "Not particularly. I'll walk with you then." Marcus followed him outside, falling into step beside the older man. "Listen, I'll be direct. There's been talk. People are concerned about your behavior. The constant trips into the forest, the supplies you're purchasing, the things you've been saying." "What things?" "About fire, about danger, about—" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "About the valley burning. It will." Marcus stopped walking. "Excuse me." Jebediah turned to face him. "The valley will burn. Maybe not this year, maybe not next, but soon. 5 years at most, if my calculations are right." "Your calculations?" Marcus's voice took on a patronizing edge. "Jebediah, I say this with respect for everything you've accomplished. But you're not a scientist. You can't predict fire. My grandfather could. My father could. I can. It's in the patterns, Marcus. Always has been." Marcus glanced around to see if anyone was listening, then lowered his voice. "People think they're using words like addled and touched. They think the isolation has affected your mind. I'm trying to help you here. By telling me I'm insane, by suggesting you might benefit from rest, maybe spending time in town rather than alone on your ranch. There's no shame in slowing down, Jeb. You've earned that right." Jebediah studied the younger man's face, seeing the genuine concern mixed with the condescension, the pity barely hidden beneath the professional demeanor. He'd seen that look before, directed at other old-timers who'd outlived their usefulness in the eyes of the community. "I appreciate your concern, Marcus, but I have work to do. Important work, and I'll be damned if I let anyone stop me." He walked away, leaving Marcus standing in the street, frustration written clearly across his features. That night, in his ranch house, Jebediah sat at his kitchen table by lamplight, the leather journal open before him, page after page of meticulous notes in 3 different hands. His grandfather's elegant script, his father's practical printing, and his own precise writing. 50 years of observations about weather, fire, drought, and patterns that repeated across decades. He ran his finger down a particular page, dated 1848. His grandfather had written, "7th year of the dry cycle. Creek at lowest point in memory. Grass brown by May. Fire season will be catastrophic if it comes." The next entry, dated September 1848. Fire swept through northern range. Lasted 9 days. Consumed everything in its path. Only stone structures survived. Jebediah turned to his own entries from the past 5 years. The patterns matched. The cycle was repeating, just as it had before, just as it would again. He closed the journal carefully, treating it with the reverence it deserved. Tomorrow, he would begin hauling the first stones. The townspeople could think what they wanted. Let them call him insane. Let them whisper behind his back. He'd survived too much, seen too much, learned too much to ignore what the patterns told him. Margaret would have understood. She'd always trusted his instincts, even when they seemed strange to others. He could almost hear her voice now, gentle but firm. "Trust what you know, Jeb. Trust what you've learned. The rest will sort itself out." He stood slowly, his knees protesting, and walked to the window. Outside, the valley lay peaceful under the stars. Beautiful and dangerous and completely unaware of what was coming. The mountains stood silent and ancient, having seen cycles like this countless times before. Patient witnesses to the arrogance of people who believed they could predict the future without bothering to study the past. Jebediah would begin tomorrow. He had 5 years, maybe less. It wouldn't be easy. At 80, every day of physical labor was a negotiation with a body that had earned its rest. But some things were worth the pain. Some things demanded sacrifice. He would build his sanctuary, and when the fire came, because it would come as surely as winter followed autumn, he would be ready, whether anyone believed him or not. The first stone weighed close to 300 pounds. Jebediah found it half buried in the creek bed 2 miles from his ranch. Granite, worn smooth by decades of flowing water. Getting it onto his wagon took 2 hours of work with a pulley system he'd rigged from a sturdy oak branch. His muscles trembling with exertion, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cool morning air. Thomas Garrett appeared on horseback halfway through the process, watching in silence as the old man maneuvered the massive stone inch by inch. "You're going to kill yourself," Thomas said finally. Jebediah didn't pause in his work. "We're all dying, Tom. Just a question of how we spend the time we've got. This is madness." "So I've heard." Thomas dismounted, walking closer. "At least tell me what you're building. Give me that much." Jebediah straightened, one hand pressed against the small of his back. For a moment he considered brushing off the question with another vague answer, but he saw something in Thomas's face. Not pity or condescension, but genuine concern from a man who'd been a good neighbor for 30 years. "A sanctuary," Jebediah said quietly. "Stone walls, heavy timber frame, surrounded by water, a place that can withstand fire when it comes. For yourself, for anyone who needs it." Thomas processed this, his expression troubled. "You really believe fire is coming? You're that certain?" "I'd stake my life on it. Am staking my life on it." "Then share the journal. Show people your evidence. Convince the town to prepare. You don't have to do this alone." Jebediah shook his head slowly. "I tried, Tom. Talked to Marcus Webb. Talked to Sarah Fletcher. They think I'm addled. They look at me and see an old man who can't accept that his time is past. They won't listen because they don't want to believe. It's easier to think I'm insane than to face the possibility that I might be right." Thomas had no answer for that. He stood there a moment longer, then remounted his horse. "I'll help you," he said. "Can't let you kill yourself hauling stones. Not without at least trying to share the burden." "Tom?" "Don't argue. Margaret would have wanted someone looking out for you. Might as well be me." He rode off before Jebediah could protest, leaving the old man alone with his stone and his gratitude, a lump forming in his throat that he swallowed down hard. The town meeting happened 3 weeks later, called specifically to address the Jebediah Cole situation, though no one used those exact words on the notice posted outside the general store. The official reason given was community concerns regarding land use and safety. Jebediah saw the notice on a Thursday afternoon when he came to town for supplies. Sarah Fletcher watched him read it. her face a mixture of sympathy and determination. "It's not meant to be hostile, Jeb," she said. "People are worried. You're working yourself to exhaustion, spending all your money on materials, and, well, they think you're not in your right mind. The meeting is Sunday after church. They'll expect you there. They want to declare me incompetent." Sarah didn't deny it. "Marcus has been talking about guardianship. Says it's for your own protection. Some folks agree with him." Jebediah folded the notice and tucked it into his pocket. "And what do you think, Sarah?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think you're the sanest man I've ever known, but I also think grief does strange things to people. Makes them see threats that aren't there, plan for futures that won't come. I've known you too long to believe you're crazy, Jeb. But I don't know if you're right either." "Fair enough," he said quietly. "I'll be at the meeting." Sunday came cold and clear. The church service seemed longer than usual, the sermon about faith and trust in God's plan that felt pointed in ways that made Jebediah shift uncomfortably in his pew. Afterward, people gathered in the church hall, filling the benches and standing along the walls. Marcus Webb stood at the front, looking every inch the concerned community leader. He waited for everyone to settle before speaking. "Thank you all for coming. I know this is difficult, but we're here because we care. Jebediah," he gestured to where the old man sat near the back, "has been a pillar of this community for 5 decades. He's earned our respect and our concern, which is why we need to address what's been happening." Jebediah remained silent, his face expressionless. Marcus continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "For the past month, Jebediah has been hauling massive stones and cutting down old-growth trees, working from dawn to dusk at an age when most men are content to rest. He's spending his savings on materials and equipment. When asked why, he speaks about fires that haven't happened, disasters he claims to predict, dangers no one else can see." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. Now, I'm not saying Jeb is a danger to himself or others, but I'm saying we have a responsibility to look after our own, especially when they can't or won't look after themselves. I'm proposing we establish a temporary guardianship, just until Jeb is thinking more clearly. "I'm thinking perfectly clearly." Jebediah's voice cut through the murmurs, quiet, but carrying an edge that made people fall silent. He stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room on him. "I appreciate the concern, Marcus. Truly, but I'm not addled. I'm not grief-stricken to the point of delusion, and I don't need anyone to manage my affairs." "Then explain," Marcus said, his patience wearing thin. "Explain why you're doing this. Give us a reason that makes sense." Jebediah reached into his coat and pulled out the leather journal, holding it up for everyone to see. This journal contains 50 years of weather observations, recorded daily by my grandfather, my father, and myself. Patterns emerge over decades. Cycles of drought and fire that repeat with remarkable consistency. "That's just weather," someone called from the crowd. "You can't predict." "I can," Jebediah interrupted. "The patterns show that we're entering a severe dry cycle. 5 years from now, maybe less, this valley will face a catastrophic fire, the kind that turns forests into ash and towns into memory. I've seen the signs, I've done the calculations, and I'm preparing for it." The silence that followed was different than before. Not the silence of concern, but of pity. Marcus shook his head sadly. "Jeb, listen to yourself. You're talking about predicting the future based on a diary. You're an educated man. You know that's not how the world works." "It's exactly how the world works," Jebediah said, his voice rising slightly. "Nature follows patterns. Seasons repeat. Cycles turn. If you watch long enough, if you record carefully enough, you can see what's coming. My grandfather knew. He survived the fire of 1848 because he prepared. My father knew. He saved 3 families during the fire of 1871 because he believed the patterns. And now you think another fire is coming," Sarah Fletcher said gently. "But Jeb, even if you're right, and I'm not saying you are, you can't build fast enough. You're one man, an 80-year-old man. This project will kill you long before any fire does." "Then it will kill me doing something that matters," Jebediah said simply. "I'd rather die building something that might save lives than live comfortably while pretending I don't see what's coming." Marcus spread his hands. appealing to the crowd. "You see what we're dealing with? He's obsessed, convinced of something no one else believes. We can't let him continue down this path." "You can't stop me," Jebediah said quietly. "Actually, we can. If enough people sign the guardianship petition, the county judge won't do a damn thing." Jebediah's voice hardened. "I'm of sound mind. I'm on my own property. I'm not breaking any laws. You might think I'm crazy, Marcus, but crazy isn't illegal, and determination isn't incompetence." He walked toward the door, then paused, turning back to address the entire room. "When the fire comes, and it will come, my door will be open. Stone and timber don't care whether you believed me or called me insane. They'll do their job regardless. I hope I'm wrong. God knows I hope I'm wrong. But if I'm right, remember this meeting. Remember who tried to stop preparation for disaster because it seemed inconvenient or uncomfortable to believe." He left them sitting in silence, the journal still clutched in his weathered hand, and walked out into the cold afternoon sunlight. Behind him, the whispers began immediately, a mixture of mockery, pity, and the faintest trace of fear in those who wondered, just for a moment, what if he's right? But wondering wasn't believing, and believing wasn't acting. So they did nothing, which was exactly what Jebediah had expected. He'd made his case. He'd warned them. Now he would go back to his work, and the valley would go back to dismissing him as the old man who'd lost his mind. The isolation deepened from that day forward. People who'd been friendly for decades now crossed the street to avoid conversation. Former friends found excuses to decline dinner invitations. The comfortable belonging he'd known for 50 years evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. It hurt more than he'd expected. But it changed nothing. The stones still needed hauling. The timber still needed cutting. The sanctuary still needed building. So Jebediah Cole, once respected, now scorned, went back to work. The work became both punishment and salvation. Each morning, Jebediah woke before dawn, his body protesting in new ways, a sharp pain in his shoulder, a persistent ache in his lower back, hands so stiff it took an hour of movement before his fingers would fully cooperate. He was asking too much of a body that had already given decades of hard labor. But he had no choice. Time, that old thief, was moving faster than he could work. Thomas Garrett kept his word. 3 times a week, he arrived at first light, bringing his wagon and his strength. He didn't talk much about why he was helping, and Jebediah didn't ask. Some gifts were better accepted without examination. They worked in near silence most days, the companionship more about shared labor than conversation. But on a morning in late May, as they maneuvered a particularly massive stone, Thomas finally broke. "You know they're talking about filing that petition, don't you? The guardianship." Jebediah grunted as he adjusted the pulley. "Let them. Marcus has 40 signatures already. Says he'll have 60 by month's end. That's enough to force a hearing. Judge Harrison knows me. Known me for 30 years. He's not going to declare me incompetent because I'm preparing for disaster. He might if enough people ask him to." Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead. "You could make this easier on yourself, Jeb. Slow down. Take breaks. Show people you're not working yourself to death. Can't slow down. Every day matters." Thomas studied him with concern deepening in his eyes. "You've lost weight. Noticed it last week. How much are you eating?" "Enough." "That's not an answer." Jebediah straightened, meeting his friend's gaze. "I appreciate what you're doing, Tom. Coming out here, helping with the work, but I don't need mothering. Maybe you do. Maybe we all need someone to tell us when we're pushing too hard. Not while the work's still there to be done." Thomas shook his head, but let it drop. They returned to hauling stones, but the concern lingered in the air between them like smoke. That evening, alone in his ranch house, Jebediah spread out large sheets of paper across his kitchen table. He'd purchased them from Sarah Fletcher a week earlier, along with charcoal pencils and a straight edge. Now, by lamplight, he began to draw. The blueprint started with the foundation, how deep the stones would need to be set, the drainage system to prevent water accumulation, the precise measurements for stability. His hands, despite their stiffness, moved with surprising precision. He'd learned drafting from his father, who'd learned it from a surveyor during the gold rush days. The skill had stayed with him across decades. The structure itself would be rectangular, 40 feet by 30 feet, with walls 3 feet thick at the base, stone on the outside, with a layer of packed earth between inner and outer walls for insulation and additional fire resistance. The roof would be heavy timber, covered with sod and a thin layer of stone. Not elegant, but functional. He drew the water diversion system next, a channel from the creek that would surround 3 sides of the structure, providing both a fire break and a source of water if the main creek ran dry. Gates that could be closed to contain the water or open to let it flow through. The interior would be simple. One large room capable of holding 50 people if necessary, with stone benches built into the walls, a central area for supplies, and ventilation shafts designed to allow air circulation while keeping out smoke and embers. As he worked, Jebediah heard Margaret's voice in his memory, clear as if she were standing beside him. "Always the planner, aren't you?" she'd said once, watching him sketch out a new barn design. "Can't just build something. Have to draw it first, measure it twice, think it through 3 times. Measure twice, cut once," he'd replied. "My father's rule. Your father was a wise man. So are you when you're not being stubborn. I'm always stubborn. I know, it's one of your charms." He smiled at the memory, though it carried the weight of loss. Margaret would have understood this project. She'd trusted his instincts, even the strange ones. Especially the strange ones. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He folded the blueprint carefully before opening it. Dr. Samuel Morrison stood on the porch, black medical bag in hand, looking uncomfortable. Samuel was 53, the valley's only physician, a man who'd delivered half the babies in Millstone and buried a quarter of its elderly. "Evening, Jeb. Mind if I come in?" Jebediah stepped aside, waving him into the kitchen. "Coffee?" "No, thank you. This isn't a social call." Samuel set his bag on the table, carefully avoiding the blueprint. "I'm here in an official capacity. Marcus Webb asked me to examine you, assess your mental state." "I see." Jebediah poured himself coffee, his movements deliberate. "And if I refuse?" "Then he'll note that in his petition. Use it as evidence that you're uncooperative and possibly unwell. And if I agree, then I'll do a fair examination, ask you some questions, give an honest assessment." Samuel met his eyes. "I've known you a long time, Jeb. I delivered half the calves on your ranch back when you first started building your herd. I sat with you the night Margaret died. I'm not your enemy here." Jebediah sat down across from him. "Ask your questions, Sam." The examination was thorough. Questions about memory, about the current date, about recent events, physical tests. "Follow this finger with your eyes. Squeeze my hands. Walk a straight line." Questions about sleep, about eating, about grief and coping, and whether he'd had any thoughts of harm. Jebediah answered everything truthfully. He knew what Samuel was looking for: signs of dementia, delusion, depression severe enough to impair judgment. He knew he'd find none of those things. When it was finished, Samuel sat back, closing his notebook. "You're physically exhausted and probably not eating enough, but mentally you're sharp as ever. Sharper than half the men in this valley. Will you tell Marcus that?" "I'll tell him exactly what I found." "But Jeb," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Being sane doesn't mean you're right. You could be completely lucid and still be wrong about this fire. Have you considered that possibility?" "Every day. And I'd rather be wrong and prepared than right and caught unprepared. Worst case scenario, I waste 5 years building something unnecessary. Best case, I save lives. That math works for me." Samuel packed his instruments away slowly. "They're going to keep pushing. Marcus has convinced a lot of people that stopping you is the compassionate thing to do." "I know. He might succeed. The petition, the guardianship, it's not impossible." "I know that too." Samuel stood at the door, one hand on the frame. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're insane. I think you're a man who sees something no one else wants to see, doing something no one else has the courage to do. That's not madness. It's just lonely." He left, and Jebediah returned to his blueprint, adding details in the lamplight until his eyes grew too heavy to focus. When he finally slept, he dreamed of fire sweeping through the valley like a living thing, hungry and relentless, consuming everything it touched, while people ran screaming toward the mountains with nowhere to hide. He woke, gasping, the pre-dawn darkness pressing in around him. The dream felt less like fantasy, and more like memory of something that hadn't happened yet. He lay there for a long moment, feeling the weight of what he was trying to do, the impossible burden of seeing disaster before it arrived and trying to convince people who had no reason to believe. But when dawn came, he rose, he ate a small breakfast, and he went back to work, because the blueprint was finished and the real building could finally begin. June brought heat that seemed to validate everything Jebediah had warned about. The grass yellowed early, the creek level dropped noticeably, and the air carried a dryness that made people's lips crack and their tempers shorten. Still, one hot summer didn't prove a pattern, and the town's skepticism held firm. The clearing Jebediah had chosen sat 3 miles from his ranch house, deeper into the forest where the ancient redwoods grew thick, enough to block out the sun at midday. It was high ground, protected on 3 sides by rocky outcroppings, with the creek running close enough to divert, but far enough to avoid flooding during spring runoff. He spent a week marking the water system with wooden stakes hammered into the ground, each one painted red at the top so he could see them clearly through the undergrowth. The stakes formed a U-shape around where the building would stand, a channel that would divert water from the creek, create a moat around the sanctuary, then return the flow downstream. Thomas helped with the surveying, using a level Jebediah had borrowed from the blacksmith. They worked in the early morning and late evening to avoid the worst of the heat, their shirts soaked through with sweat within an hour of starting. "This creek diversion," Thomas said, driving another stake into the ground. "How deep are you planning to make it?" 4 feet. "Wide enough that embers can't jump it. Deep enough that the water flow will be strong enough to put out anything that tries." "That's a lot of digging. Everything about this is a lot of something." Jebediah wiped his forehead with a rag. "Lot of digging, lot of stone, lot of timber, lot of time I don't have." Thomas straightened, looking at the dozens of stakes marking the perimeter. "You need more help. Can't just be the 2 of us." "Who's going to help?" "The town thinks I'm insane." "Not everyone. Some folks are starting to wonder. This heat, the early drought, it's got people nervous. Maybe not believing your predictions exactly, but less certain you're completely wrong." Jebediah hammered in another stake with perhaps more force than necessary. "Wondering isn't helping. Nervous isn't preparation. When the fire comes, wondering won't save anyone." "You're angry." "I'm tired, Tom. Tired of being looked at like I'm touched in the head. Tired of working myself half to death while people who could help choose to stand aside. Tired of carrying this alone." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Thomas had never heard Jebediah speak this openly about the burden he was carrying. "You're not alone," Thomas said quietly. "I'm here, and there are others who might come around if you gave them a chance." "Like who?" "Young Robert Fletcher, for one. Sarah's son. He's been asking questions. Wants to see the journal, understand the patterns you're talking about. He's got a good head on his shoulders, and he's strong enough to do real work." Jebediah considered this. Robert was 23, recently returned from 2 years working on the railroads in Sacramento. He'd always been curious, the kind of boy, now man, who asked why instead of just accepting what he was told. What does Sarah think about that? She's not happy. But Robert's his own man now, makes his own choices. A week later, Robert Fletcher appeared at the clearing, arriving on horseback just after dawn. He was tall and lean, with his mother's sharp eyes and his late father's steady hands. He dismounted and walked up to where Jebediah was mixing mortar. No preamble or small talk. "Mr. Cole, I'd like to see the journal. The weather patterns you've been tracking. My mother says I'm wasting my time, but I figure I'm old enough to decide that for myself." Jebediah set down his mixing stick, studying the young man. "Why?" "Because everyone in town says you're crazy, but crazy people don't usually have 50 years of data backing up their claims. I'd like to see the evidence before I make up my mind." "Fair enough." Jebediah pulled the leather journal from his saddlebag, handling it with care. "This goes back to 1847. My grandfather started it after the big fire that year. Every single day he recorded temperature, wind direction, precipitation, and general conditions. My father continued it. Now it's mine." Robert opened the journal, his eyes moving over the meticulous entries. He turned pages slowly, comparing years, looking for the patterns Jebediah had described. 20 minutes passed in silence as he read, occasionally glancing up at Jebediah with questions in his eyes. These dry cycles, Robert said finally, they happen roughly every 50 years, 45 to 55, depending on other factors. But yes, that's the pattern. And according to this, we're at the beginning of one now, fourth year of what will likely be a 7 to 10-year cycle. The worst of it, the year when fire becomes catastrophic, usually hits around year 5 or 6. Robert closed the journal carefully. This is remarkable. Why hasn't anyone taken this seriously? People don't like uncomfortable truths. Easier to dismiss the messenger than face the message. Jebediah took the journal back, tucking it away. So now you've seen it. What do you think? I think you're either the most prepared man in the valley, or you're wasting an extraordinary amount of effort on an elaborate delusion. Robert smiled slightly. But I also think the evidence leans toward the former. When do we start? We? You need help. I'm strong. I'm young enough not to break after a day's work, and I'm curious enough to want to see this through, unless you're too proud to accept another pair of hands. Jebediah felt something ease in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. Could use someone who can dig. The creek diversion needs to be finished before we can start the foundation. Then let's get to it. They worked together that day and the next, falling into a rhythm. Robert had the energy of youth, but also the wisdom to pace himself, to take breaks when needed, to listen when Jebediah offered guidance based on 5 decades of hard labor. On the third day, 2 more men appeared. Brothers named Jacob and Michael Hart, farmers in their 30s who'd heard about Robert's involvement and decided to investigate for themselves. We're not saying we believe, Jacob said. The elder of the Ides, too. But we're not saying we don't either. And if there's work to be done that might save lives, seems foolish not to help just because we're not certain. Every hand helps, Jebediah said simply. Welcome. The work accelerated with 4 men instead of 2. The creek diversion took shape, a curving trench that grew deeper each day. The stones that had taken Jebediah hours to move alone now moved in half the time with multiple people working the pulleys. The timber cutting, which had left him exhausted and shaking, became manageable with Robert's youth and the Hart brothers' experience. But even as help arrived, the mockery from town intensified. Marcus Webb made sure everyone knew about the fools who joined the old man's delusion. Sarah Fletcher publicly disapproved of her son's involvement, though Jebediah suspected her protests were more for appearance than genuine opposition. At the saloon, bets were being placed about how long the project would last before Jebediah gave up or collapsed from exhaustion. The petition for guardianship gained more signatures. 62 people, nearly a third of the town's adult population, had signed it by the end of June. Judge Harrison set a hearing date for late July, giving Jebediah 30 days to prepare his defense. You need a lawyer, Thomas advised one evening as they reviewed the situation. Can't go into that hearing unprepared. Don't have money for lawyers. Spent most of my savings on materials. Then represent yourself, but do it smart. Bring the journal. Bring Dr. Morrison's assessment. Show the judge you're competent and committed, not obsessed and irrational. Jebediah nodded slowly, knowing Thomas was right, but feeling the weight of yet another battle he'd have to fight. It wasn't enough to build the sanctuary. Now he had to defend his right to build it, to prove his sanity to people who'd already decided he was mad. That night, he sat on his porch with the journal, watching the sun set over the valley he'd called home for 52 years. The drought was visible in the landscape, in the brown grass, the lower creek levels, the dust that rose easily with every wind. The signs were everywhere for those willing to see them. He wondered, not for the first time, if he would live to see the fire, if his heart would hold out through the years of labor ahead, if the sanctuary would be finished in time, if anyone would believe him before it was too late. But wondering changed nothing. So he would go to the hearing, he would make his case, and win or lose, he would continue building because some things mattered more than comfort, more than reputation, more than the mockery of fools who couldn't see past tomorrow. The hearing took place on a Thursday afternoon in late July, in the county courthouse, 20 miles from Millstone. Jebediah rode his wagon there alone, the leather journal wrapped in oilcloth and tucked carefully beside him. The journey took 4 hours, giving him plenty of time to rehearse arguments he'd probably never get to make. Judge Harrison presided, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation for fairness. He'd known Jebediah for 3 decades, had purchased cattle from him, had attended Margaret's funeral. But friendship only went so far when the law was involved. Marcus Webb presented the case for guardianship with practiced eloquence. He painted a picture of a once competent man undone by grief and age, obsessed with predictions no reasonable person could make, spending his life savings on a project that served no purpose beyond satisfying a delusion. He called witnesses. Sarah Fletcher, who testified about the strange supplies Jebediah had been purchasing. Pastor Williams, who spoke about Jebediah's withdrawal from the church community. Even Dr. Morrison, who'd found Jebediah physically exhausted and underweight. When Jebediah's turn came, he stood slowly, feeling every one of his 80 years pressing down on his shoulders. He didn't have fancy words or legal arguments. He had only the truth. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady despite the nervousness in his gut. "I'm not going to pretend I'm the same man I was 30 years ago. My body's slower. My patience is shorter. My wife is gone, and that loss changed me in ways I can't fully explain. But my mind is sound, and what I'm doing makes perfect sense if you're willing to look at the evidence." He unwrapped the journal and placed it on the judge's desk. 50 years of weather data, patterns that repeat with remarkable consistency. Dry cycles that lead to catastrophic fire seasons. My grandfather survived the fire of 1848 by preparing. My father saved 3 families in 1871 the same way. I'm doing what they taught me to do, reading the signs and acting on them. Judge Harrison opened the journal, scanning several pages. "This is impressive record-keeping, Jebediah. But record-keeping isn't prediction. How can you be certain fire is coming? I can't be certain the way you can be certain the sun will rise tomorrow, but I can be certain the way a sailor is certain about weather, or a farmer is certain about seasons. The patterns are there. The conditions are building. Every sign I've been taught to recognize is present." Marcus stood. "Your Honor, with respect, this is exactly the kind of magical thinking that concerns us. Mr. Cole is basing life-altering decisions on what amounts to superstition dressed up as science." "It's not superstition," Jebediah said, his voice hardening. "It's observation. It's data. It's the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations. Just because you don't understand it doesn't make it invalid. Then why doesn't anyone else see what you see?" Marcus challenged. "If the signs are so obvious, why aren't the ranchers preparing? Why aren't the fire wardens concerned? Why is it only you, an 80-year-old man, who claims to see this coming disaster?" Jebediah was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. Finally, he said, "Because seeing requires believing, and believing requires being willing to accept uncomfortable truths. Most people would rather ignore a possibility than prepare for it. It's human nature. We tell ourselves, 'It won't happen to me,' right up until it does." Judge Harrison studied him for a long moment. "Dr. Morrison's assessment says you're mentally competent. Your own testimony is coherent and reasoned. But Mr. Webb makes a valid point about the physical toll this work is taking on you. At your age, this kind of labor could kill you. Living could kill me, Your Honor. So could doing nothing, at least this way if I die. It's for something that might matter." The judge leaned back in his chair, weighing everything he had heard. "I'm going to deny the guardianship petition," he said finally. Marcus's face fell, but the judge held up a hand. "But I'm doing so with strong recommendations. Mr. Cole, you need to take better care of yourself. Eat properly. Rest adequately. If you're going to continue this project, do it responsibly. And if your physical condition deteriorates to the point where it becomes a genuine concern, we may revisit this matter." "Understood, Your Honor. And Mr. Webb, I appreciate your concern for a member of your community, but being eccentric isn't grounds for guardianship. Neither is pursuing an unpopular course of action. As long as Mr. Cole remains competent and isn't violating any laws, he has the right to spend his time and money as he sees fit." The gavel came down, and it was over. Jebediah walked out of the courthouse, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion that left him slightly unsteady on his feet. He'd won, but it felt less like victory and more like a temporary reprieve. The ride home was long and dark, the wagon creaking beneath him, his body aching from hours of sitting and the stress of the hearing. He arrived at his ranch well past midnight, too tired to even properly stable his horse. He simply removed the harness, gave the animal water and feed, and stumbled into his house to collapse into bed. In his dreams, Margaret sat beside him on their porch, young and vibrant as she'd been when they first met. "You're exhausting yourself," she said gently. "I know. The judge was right. This work could kill you." "I know that too." "Then why? Why push yourself like this?" He looked at her, seeing the concern in her eyes, the love that had never wavered even when she didn't understand his choices. "Because if I'm right and I do nothing, I'll have failed everyone in this valley, including you, including the life we built here together. I'm already gone, Jeb. You can't fail me. I can fail your memory. I can fail the woman who taught me that preparation and hard work matter. That seeing trouble coming and doing nothing about it is its own kind of sin." She smiled sadly. "Always the stubborn one. You married me anyway." "I did, and I'd do it again." He woke to find his pillow damp, whether from sweat or tears he couldn't say. The dream lingered, more real than the empty house around him, and for a moment the loneliness was so acute it took his breath away. But the sun was rising, and the work waited. It always waited. By mid-August, the foundation of the sanctuary was taking shape. The creek diversion was complete, water flowing through the channel exactly as Jebediah had planned. The first courses of stone were laid, massive granite blocks fitted together with mortar mixed from sand hauled from the creek bed. Robert Fletcher proved invaluable. His youth and strength allowed him to do work that would have broken Jebediah, while his intelligence meant he could follow complex instructions and anticipate needs before they were voiced. The Hart brothers were steady workers, showing up 3 days a week without fail, their contribution measured and reliable. But the centerpiece of the construction was the gate. Jebediah designed it himself, working late into the nights to get the specifications right. It would be heavy timber reinforced with iron straps, purchased from the blacksmith, hung on massive stone pillars that would flank the entrance, large enough to admit a wagon, strong enough to withstand both fire and forced entry. "Why make it so elaborate?" Robert asked, watching Jebediah sketch the design. "A simple opening would be easier." "Because a gate is a statement," Jebediah explained. "It says this is a stronghold, but a gate that opens says, you're welcome here. I want both messages clear. This isn't just a fortress. It's a sanctuary. Anyone who needs it can enter, but only through this gate, where I can control access and keep everyone safe. You really think they'll come? The people who called you insane. When the fire comes, they'll come. Pride disappears quickly when survival is at stake." Jebediah added another detail to the design. "And when they do, this gate will be open, no matter what they said, no matter how they treated me. Open." Robert was quiet for a moment. "That's a harder thing than building the walls, isn't it? Keeping your heart open to people who've hurt you. Harder than anything else I'm doing," Jebediah admitted. "But it's also the whole point. Protection isn't just about walls and water. It's about being willing to extend safety to others, even when they don't deserve it. Especially when they don't deserve it." They began constructing the gate pillars in early September, each one requiring dozens of stones fitted with precision, the mortar mixed and applied with care that couldn't be rushed. The physical labor was punishing, but Jebediah found a rhythm in it, a meditation in the repetitive work that eased some of the loneliness that had become his constant companion. The town continued to mock him, but now, with the foundation visible and the gate pillars rising, the mockery carried an edge of uncertainty. This wasn't the scattered work of a madman. It was organized, planned, substantial. People began to wonder, quietly, privately, what would happen if he was right. Winter brought relief from the heat, but no relief from the work. Snow fell in the mountains, and the valley received enough rain to ease some of the immediate drought concerns. People relaxed, pointing to the precipitation as proof that Jebediah's predictions were wrong. Even some of his helpers wavered. "Maybe the cycle is breaking," Jacob Hart suggested, one cold morning as they worked on the walls. "Could be this winter changes everything." Jebediah didn't pause in his work, carefully setting another stone into place. One wet winter doesn't break a 5-year drought cycle. It's a reprieve, not a solution. Check the journal entries from 1868 through 1871. Same pattern, 4th year had a wet winter. Gave people false hope. Then the fifth summer came, drier than anything they'd seen before, and the fire that followed killed 19 people. Jacob fell silent, chastened, but Jebediah understood the doubt. When disaster seemed distant, preparation felt foolish. It was only when the flames were visible that people wished they'd acted sooner. By spring of 1899, the sanctuary's walls stood 8 feet high, thick and solid, the stones fitted with a precision that came from decades of building fence lines and barn foundations. The structure was beginning to look real, substantial, impossible to dismiss as the ravings of a madman. But Jebediah knew the walls alone weren't enough. Fire didn't just burn, it jumped, it flew, it found ways round obstacles. He needed multiple layers of protection, defensive rings that would stop the flames no matter how they approached. He began digging fire-break trenches in a wide perimeter around the sanctuary. These would be 6 feet wide and 3 feet deep, cleared of all vegetation, filled with gravel hauled from the creek bed. Nothing for fire to feed on, nothing to carry embers across the gap. Thomas Garrett, now 68 and feeling his own age, helped mark the trench lines with stakes and string. "This is going to take months of digging," he observed, looking at the scale of what Jebediah was planning. "Then we'd better start now. Jeb, you're 82 years old. How much longer can you keep this up?" It was a fair question. Jebediah's hands trembled more than they used to. His breathing came harder after exertion. He'd lost more weight despite trying to eat properly, his body consuming itself faster than food could replenish it. But stopping wasn't an option. "Long enough," he said simply. "That's all that matters." Robert Fletcher had brought 3 more young men into the work, friends from his railroad days who'd drifted back to the valley looking for work. They helped with the trenches, the digging proceeding faster than Jebediah had dared hope. Still, even with 6 men working, the project seemed endless. Every completed section revealed 10 more that needed attention. One afternoon in late April, Sarah Fletcher appeared at the work site, bringing a basket of food. She stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the activity with an expression Jebediah couldn't quite read. "Robert," she called out, "could I speak with you a moment?" Her son set down his shovel and walked over, and Jebediah watched their conversation from a distance. Sarah's gestures were animated, clearly upset about something. Robert listened patiently, then shook his head, his own response firm but respectful. The exchange lasted several minutes before Sarah turned and walked away, her back rigid with displeasure. Robert returned to the digging, but Jebediah caught his arm. "What was that about?" "She wants me to stop helping. Says I'm wasting my time on a fool's errand, that associating with you is damaging my reputation in town." "Maybe she's right." "She's not." Robert picked up his shovel. "I've read the journal, Mr. Cole. I've seen the patterns. I'm not doing this because I'm certain you're right. I'm doing it because I'm certain enough, and that's all that matters. If there's a chance, even a small one, that this sanctuary saves lives, then every hour I spend here is time well spent. Your mother doesn't see it that way. My mother sees what everyone else sees. An old man building something that looks crazy from the outside, but I've been inside it. I've seen the precision of your planning, the logic of your design. This isn't madness, Mr. Cole. This is preparation by someone who understands things the rest of us don't." The young man's faith meant more than Jebediah could express. He simply nodded and returned to his own work, but something warm had settled in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in the 2 years since the project began, the sense that he wasn't entirely alone in this. By summer of 1899, the drought returned with a vengeance. The wet winter had been exactly what Jebediah predicted. A false reprieve. Now the grass browned early again, the creek levels dropped to concerning lows, and the heat felt more oppressive than previous years. The town's mockery gave way to nervous jokes. People still didn't believe fire was inevitable, but they'd stopped finding Jebediah's warnings quite so amusing. Some ranchers began clearing brush from around their homes. A few families built root cellars with thicker roofs. No one admitted they were taking Jebediah's predictions seriously, but behavior spoke louder than words. Marcus Webb organized a town meeting to discuss fire preparedness. It was framed as general safety planning, not a validation of Jebediah's warnings. But the timing was obvious. Jebediah attended, sitting in the back while Marcus outlined basic fire safety measures, clearing brush, keeping water barrels ready, creating escape routes. When questions were called for, Thomas Garrett stood. "Seems to me we've got someone in this valley who's been studying fire for decades. Maybe we should hear what he has to say." All eyes turned to Jebediah. Marcus looked uncomfortable but gestured for him to speak. Jebediah stood slowly, gathering his thoughts. "Fire in the forest isn't like fire in a stove," he began. "It creates its own weather, generates wind strong enough to throw embers a mile ahead of the main blaze. The heat alone can kill you before the flames arrive. If you're caught in the open when a firestorm hits, clearing brush and keeping water barrels won't save you. You need stone walls, deep water, and distance from anything that can burn." "So what do you suggest?" someone called out. "That we all abandon our homes and hide in your fortress?" "If necessary, yes. But what I'd suggest is that you start preparing now. Build stone shelters, dig water channels, clear wide fire breaks around your properties. Don't wait until you see smoke on the horizon, because by then it's too late." "Easy for you to say," Marcus interjected. "You've spent 2 years and your life savings on your project. Most of us have ranches to run, families to feed. We can't just drop everything to build fortresses that might never be needed." "You're right," Jebediah acknowledged. "It's not easy. Nothing worth doing is. But consider this. How much would you pay to save your family's lives? How much effort is too much when the alternative is watching everything you love turn to ash?" The room fell silent. No one had an answer for that. The meeting ended with vague resolutions to stay vigilant and take reasonable precautions, which Jebediah knew meant most people would do little or nothing. They'd been given information and had chosen to dismiss it, which meant when the fire came, the consequences would be their own. He left the meeting feeling neither vindicated nor frustrated, just tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. Tired of trying to convince people who didn't want to be convinced. Tired of carrying a burden no one else would share. That night, working by lantern light to finish a section of the trench system, he felt his heart stutter in his chest, a moment of arrhythmia that left him gasping and dizzy. He sat down heavily on a pile of excavated dirt, one hand pressed to his chest, waiting for the sensation to pass. It did, eventually, but it left him shaken, aware in a way he'd been avoiding that his body was reaching its limits. He had perhaps 2 more years of this kind of work in him, maybe 3 if he was lucky. Would it be enough? Would the sanctuary be finished before he gave out completely? He didn't know, but he couldn't stop to find out. The fire-break trenches still needed completing. The roof still needed building. The water storage system still needed testing. So much work remained, and time, that thief, kept stealing days faster than he could use them. But he would keep going, because stopping meant accepting defeat, and defeat meant death for people who trusted him, even if they didn't know it yet. So he stood, picked up his shovel, and went back to digging, his breath coming hard but his determination unshaken, building salvation one shovelful at a time. October of 1900 brought a letter that changed everything. It arrived at Jebediah's ranch house on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by the postal rider who made the circuit through the valley twice a week. The envelope was thick and official-looking, addressed in handwriting Jebediah didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from a man named Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a meteorologist at the University of California. Jebediah read it 3 times, each reading making his hands shake more than the last. Dr. Hartwell had obtained a copy of Jebediah's weather journal. How, he didn't say, and had analyzed the patterns using mathematical models and meteorological data unavailable to previous generations. His conclusion was stark and terrible. Jebediah's predictions weren't just accurate, they were conservative. The fire you're anticipating will likely arrive in summer 1902, not 1903 or 1904 as your calculations suggest, Dr. Hartwell wrote. The confluence of factors, prolonged drought, accumulation of fuel load in the forests, atmospheric pressure patterns we're observing, indicates an acceleration of the cycle. Moreover, the intensity may exceed historical precedent. Your sanctuary is not merely advisable, it may be the only structure in the valley capable of withstanding what's coming. Jebediah sat at his kitchen table, the letter clutched in his trembling hands, feeling the weight of this knowledge settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. 2 years. Not 3 or 4. 2 years to finish everything, and he was already behind schedule, already pushing his failing body past reasonable limits. He rode to the sanctuary the next morning, arriving to find Robert and the Hart brothers already at work on the roof timbers. He gathered them around, showed them the letter, watched their expressions shift from skepticism to understanding to fear. 2 years. Jacob said quietly, "Can we finish in 2 years?" "We have to." Jebediah looked at each of them in turn. "But we need to change our approach. I've been trying to do this gradually, carefully, making sure every detail is perfect. We don't have that luxury anymore. We need more help. We need to work faster. We need—" He paused, the words catching in his throat as a realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. "We need to tell the town, not predictions, facts, scientific analysis from a university meteorologist. Maybe they'll listen to someone with credentials they respect." That evening, Jebediah rode into Millstone and nailed a copy of Dr. Hartwell's letter to the door of the general store, where everyone would see it. Below it, he added his own handwritten note: "Town meeting, Saturday at noon. Bring your questions, bring your doubts, but come prepared to hear the truth." Saturday arrived cold and gray. Jebediah stood in the church hall, Dr. Hartwell's letter in one hand, his grandfather's journal in the other, watching as nearly the entire town filled the benches. Marcus Webb sat in the front row, his expression guarded. Sarah Fletcher sat near the back, Robert beside her, his presence a statement of loyalty that didn't go unnoticed. Jebediah didn't wait for someone else to start the meeting. He simply began speaking, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years of work and a lifetime of observation. "I know what you think of me. I've heard the words, insane, obsessed, touched. I've been called worse things than that, and I've survived them all. But this isn't about me. It's about what's coming, and what we have less than 2 years to prepare for." He held up the letter. Dr. Edmund Hartwell is a meteorologist at the University of California. He studied weather patterns across the entire western region. He's analyzed my grandfather's journal using mathematics and science I don't fully understand. And his conclusion is simple. The fire I've been warning about is coming sooner and stronger than I predicted. Summer of 1902. 18 months from now. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Marcus stood. "And we're supposed to just take this stranger's word for it? Some professor who's never even been to our valley? You don't have to take his word. You don't have to take my word. Look outside. Look at the creek levels. Look at how brown the grass is in October, when it should still be green. Look at how many fires we've had in the past 3 summers. The signs are everywhere if you're willing to see them. So what do you expect us to do?" A rancher called out. "Abandon our homes? Hide in your fortress? I expect you to prepare. Build stone shelters, clear fire breaks, create escape routes, store water and supplies. And yes, if the fire comes and you have nowhere else to go, the sanctuary is there, for anyone who needs it. No questions asked, no judgment rendered." "Why should we trust you?" someone else asked. "You've been wrong about when it's coming." "I wasn't wrong. I was optimistic." "There's a difference." Jebediah's voice hardened. "And trust isn't the issue here. Survival is. You can distrust me all you want, but when you see smoke on the horizon, you're going to have to choose pride or life. I'm hoping you choose life." The meeting dissolved into arguments and debates. Some people left convinced, others more skeptical than before. But something had shifted. Dr. Hartwell's letter had given Jebediah's warnings a legitimacy they'd previously lacked. Science had validated what intuition had predicted, and that mattered to people who valued education and credentials. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. People started preparing. Not everyone, not even most, but enough that the change was visible. Families cleared brush from around their homes. Several ranchers began building stone root cellars with reinforced roofs. The church organized a committee to stockpile emergency supplies, and volunteers appeared at the sanctuary. 10, then 15, then 20 people who decided that helping finish the project was better than waiting to see if Jebediah was right. Some came because they believed. Others came because they hedged their bets. A few came simply because the work needed doing and they had hands capable of helping. The pace of construction accelerated dramatically. The roof went up in 6 weeks instead of the projected 6 months. The interior stone benches were installed. The ventilation system was completed. Supply storage areas were marked off and reinforced, but it was during the excavation for the supply storage that they made the discovery that reframed everything Jebediah thought he knew about his project. Robert's shovel struck something that wasn't dirt or rock. He called Jebediah over, and together they uncovered what looked like worked stone, old and weathered but clearly human-made. As they cleared more soil, the shape emerged, an entrance to an underground chamber, carefully constructed from fitted stones, the opening sealed with a massive slab. It took 6 men to move the slab. What they found beneath left them all speechless. A natural cave system, expanded and reinforced with stonework that predated anything Jebediah had built. Water flowed through it, an underground stream that connected to the creek but ran deeper, protected from surface fire. The walls were blackened from old smoke, but the structure itself was sound. And carved into the stone near the entrance was a date, 1847. Below it, initials, J.C. Jebediah's grandfather. Jonathan Cole. Thomas Garrett, who'd climbed down into the chamber, called up, "Jeb, you need to see this." Jebediah descended carefully, his old knees protesting. In the flickering light of their lanterns, he saw what his grandfather had built. A complete underground sanctuary, with chambers for shelter, storage areas carved into the walls, and that constant flow of water providing both drinking supply and temperature regulation. On a stone shelf sat a leather journal, newer than his grandfather's, but still aged, the pages brittle. Jebediah opened it with shaking hands and began to read his father's writing. "If you found this, it means the patterns held true, and you followed the knowledge we passed down. Your grandfather built this after surviving the fire of 1847. He knew the cycle would repeat. I reinforced it in 1870, preparing for the fire of 1871 that killed so many others. Now it falls to you. The surface sanctuary you're building is good, necessary even, but this underground chamber is our insurance. When the fire becomes too intense, when the heat above ground becomes unsurvivable, this is where people retreat. This is what saves them when everything else fails." Jebediah sank down onto a stone ledge, overwhelmed. His grandfather and father had never told him about this place. They'd left only the journal, the patterns, the knowledge, letting him rediscover what they'd built, letting him come to the same conclusions they had reached, trusting that if he was worthy of the task, he'd find this place when the time was right. "How did they keep it secret?" Robert asked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Because they knew," Jebediah said quietly. "They knew that if people knew about it, they'd rely on it. They'd stop preparing themselves. The surface sanctuary forces people to take the threat seriously, to change their behavior, to prepare. But this," he gestured to the underground chamber, "this is the final refuge when all other defenses fail." They emerged back into daylight, each man quiet with the weight of what they'd discovered. The sanctuary wasn't just Jebediah's project. It was a legacy 3 generations deep, built on wisdom passed down through time, protected by men who understood that survival required both preparation and secrecy. That night, Jebediah sat in his kitchen, reading his father's journal by lamplight. Entry after entry detailed the reinforcement work, the testing of the water flow, the stockpiling of supplies in sealed containers that would last for years. His father had prepared this refuge for him, just as his grandfather had prepared it for his father. The responsibility felt heavier now, weighted with family obligations and inherited duty. But it also felt right, as if all his life had been leading to this moment, the continuation of a sacred task begun long before his birth and extending far beyond his death. He had 18 months. The sanctuary above ground was nearly complete. The underground chamber needed cleaning, restocking, and testing. But now, at least, he knew the full scope of what his family had built across 3 generations. Protection, safety, salvation. He would finish what they had started. And when the fire came, because it would come as surely as tomorrow followed today, both sanctuaries would be ready. Spring of 1902 arrived with a heat that felt malevolent. By April, the temperature regularly reached 90 degrees. By May, it pushed past 100. The creek that had flowed reliably for generations dwindled to a trickle. Grass didn't just yellow, it dried to brittle brown. Trees that had survived decades began showing stress, their leaves curling and dropping months too early. The town stopped mocking Jebediah. Now they watched the sky with increasing anxiety, seeing what he'd seen years before. The signs of approaching catastrophe written in parched earth and withered vegetation. The sanctuary stood complete. Walls 15 feet high, 3 feet thick. Heavy timber roof covered with sod and stone. The creek diversion flowing strong despite the drought, fed by the underground spring they'd discovered. Fire-break trenches surrounding the entire compound in concentric rings. The reinforced gate hung on its massive stone pillars, capable of being closed and barred but currently standing open. And below ground, the hidden chamber waited, cleaned and restocked, its existence known only to Jebediah, Thomas, Robert, and the Hart brothers. They'd made a pact. The underground refuge would remain secret until it was needed, revealed only when surface survival became impossible. But Jebediah knew one more element was needed. A warning system, a way to tell people scattered across the valley that the time had come, that safety waited, but they needed to move immediately. He found the bell in an abandoned mining camp 30 miles north. It was massive. 400 pounds of bronze, cast decades earlier to call miners to their shifts. It took 8 men and 2 wagons to transport it to the sanctuary, and another week to construct the wooden tower that would hold it high enough for its sound to carry across the valley. Thomas Garrett supervised the installation, ensuring the bell was mounted securely on a pivot that would allow it to swing freely. A thick rope dangled down to ground level, within easy reach. How far will it carry? Robert asked, looking at the bell skeptically. Jebediah pulled the rope. The bell's deep voice rolled out across the valley, echoing off the mountains, vibrating in their chests. They stood in silence as the sound faded, then faded further, until finally it was gone, but the memory of it remained in their ears. Far enough, Jebediah said with satisfaction. He spent the next week riding through the valley, stopping at every ranch and homestead, explaining the bell's purpose. When you hear it ring, you move. Don't stop to gather belongings. Don't try to save property. Just get your families and head for the sanctuary. The bell means fire is close and moving fast. Minutes will matter. Most people listened seriously now. The drought had converted skeptics into believers. Even Marcus Webb, who'd fought so hard against Jebediah's warnings, had quietly begun preparing his own property, though he never admitted it publicly. Sarah Fletcher stopped Jebediah one afternoon outside the general store. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "I called you insane. I tried to keep Robert from helping. I signed that guardianship petition. I was wrong, Jeb, about all of it. You were trying to protect your son. Nothing wrong with that. Except I was protecting him from the one person trying to save him." She met his eyes, her own bright with unshed tears. "If we survive this, I'll never doubt you again. If we survive this, Sarah, doubting will be the least of anyone's concerns." By June, Jebediah had moved his most essential possessions to the sanctuary. His grandfather's journal, Margaret's wedding ring, a few photographs, and nothing else. Material goods meant nothing if you weren't alive to use them. He spent his nights at the sanctuary now, sleeping on one of the stone benches, waking at dawn to check the perimeter, the water flow, the structural integrity of every element they'd built. His body was failing rapidly. The tremor in his hands was constant now. His breathing came hard even without exertion. He'd lost so much weight that his clothes hung loose, and the mirror showed a man who looked 90 rather than 84. Dr. Morrison visited one afternoon, uninvited, carrying his medical bag. "Let me examine you," he said, no room for argument in his tone. Jebediah submitted, knowing what the doctor would find. When Morrison finished, his expression was grave. "Your heart is struggling, Jeb. You're exhausted past the point where rest can help. You need to stop. Let others handle the final preparations. Can't stop. Too much still to do. Then you'll die before the fire ever comes." And all this work will have been for nothing. Won't be for nothing. The sanctuary will still be here. It'll save people whether I'm alive to see it or not. Morrison packed his instruments away, slowly. You're the stubbornest man I've ever met. Also, the bravest. Those two qualities don't always go together. Margaret used to say the same thing. Jebediah smiled slightly, usually right before telling me I was being a damned fool about something. Was she right? Usually, yes, but not about this. This needed doing, and I was the only one willing to do it. If that makes me a fool, I'm comfortable with it. The doctor left, and Jebediah sat alone on the sanctuary wall, looking out over the valley he'd called home for 55 years. How many people down there would survive what was coming? How many would reach the sanctuary in time? How many would die because they waited too long, believed too little, or simply got caught in the wrong place at the wrong moment? He couldn't save everyone, but he could save some. That would have to be enough. July brought lightning without rain. Dry lightning, they called it. The most dangerous kind. Each storm felt like a threat. Each flash a potential spark for the conflagration everyone now feared. Jebediah organized drills. He rang the bell and timed how long it took for people to arrive at the sanctuary. The first drill, only 12 people showed up. By the fourth drill, nearly 80, more than a third of the valley's population. They were learning, slowly, reluctantly, but learning. Thomas Garrett pulled him aside after one drill. You need to tell them about the underground chamber. If the surface sanctuary gets overrun, not yet. Once people know it exists, they'll treat it as a guarantee. They'll take risks they shouldn't because they think there's always a deeper fallback. Right now, they're scared enough to be careful. That fear is keeping them safe. And when do we tell them? When the fire's here. When there's no choice left. When keeping the secret becomes more dangerous than revealing it. Thomas didn't like it, but he accepted it. Trust was like that sometimes. Believing in someone's judgment even when you didn't fully understand their reasoning. August arrived, and with it came a heat that redefined what they thought possible. 110 degrees, 115. The air itself felt hostile, each breath searing the lungs. Animals went mad with thirst. The creek that fed the sanctuary's moat dropped to barely a trickle, and even the underground spring showed signs of stress. Jebediah spent hours each day monitoring the water levels, calculating how long their reserves would last, adjusting flow rates to maximize efficiency. This was the kind of detail work his grandfather and father had documented in their journals, the fine-tuning that made the difference between survival and death. Robert found him one afternoon, collapsed against the sanctuary wall, breathing hard and clutching his chest. "Mr. Cole," Jebediah waved him off. "I'm fine. Just need a moment." "You're not fine. You need to rest. Let me take over the water monitoring. You don't know the patterns. Don't know what to look for. Then teach me. Show me what you're doing. Explain the patterns, and let me handle it. You've taught me everything else. Teach me this." It went against every instinct Jebediah had. He'd carried this burden alone for so long that delegating felt like abandonment. But Robert was right. If Jebediah collapsed from exhaustion, all his knowledge would die with him. The patterns needed to be passed on, just as his grandfather had passed them to his father, and his father to him. So he taught. He showed Robert how to read the water levels, how to adjust the gates, how to calculate reserve capacity. He explained the subtle signs that indicated whether the underground spring was stable or declining. He shared the wisdom of 3 generations in the space of a week, compressing decades of learning into intense, focused sessions. Robert absorbed it all with the fierce intelligence that had made him valuable from the beginning. By the end of August, he could manage the water system as well as Jebediah, perhaps better given his younger eyes and steadier hands. "You're ready," Jebediah said one evening, reviewing Robert's calculations. "When the fire comes, and it's coming soon, I can feel it. You'll be able to manage the sanctuary if I can't. Don't talk like that. You'll be fine. I'm 84 years old with a failing heart and a body that's been pushed past any reasonable limit. I won't be fine, Robert, but the sanctuary will be, and the people in it will be, and that's what matters." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the drought-ravaged valley. The sky was clear, no rain clouds, no relief, just endless, punishing blue that promised another day of heat and danger. "How do you live with it?" Robert asked suddenly. "Knowing what's coming, seeing disaster approach while everyone else goes about their lives. You don't live with it," Jebediah said quietly. "You carry it, like carrying a heavy load up a steep hill. You can't put it down without it rolling back and hurting people. So you carry it until you reach the top, or until your body gives out, or until someone else can take the weight from your shoulders. And then you hope it was enough." The first week of September brought a change in the wind. It shifted from west to east, blowing hot and dry from the desert, carrying the smell of distant fires. Smoke appeared on the horizon. Not from the valley, but from beyond the mountains, towns and forests already burning. Jebediah stood on the sanctuary wall, watching that smoke, and knew with absolute certainty that the time had come. Not tomorrow, not next week, soon, perhaps days, perhaps hours. He rang the bell. Its deep voice rolled out across the valley, and this time it wasn't a drill. This was the real thing, the warning he'd prepared for, the moment 5 years of work had been building toward. The sound hung in the air like a physical presence. And in the town, on ranches, in homes scattered across the valley, people stopped what they were doing and looked toward the mountains, and they began to move. They came in wagons and on horseback, on foot carrying children, driving cattle and clutching whatever possessions they deemed too precious to leave behind. They came in a steady stream that grew into a flood, faces tight with fear and the dawning realization that Jebediah Cole had been right all along. The stone archway, the entrance Jebediah had designed to be both defensible and welcoming, became a threshold between worlds. On one side, the valley they'd always known. On the other, the sanctuary that promised survival. Thomas Garrett stood at the entrance, directing traffic with the authority of someone who'd spent years working alongside Jebediah. Families with small children to the left, livestock to the holding pens on the right. Everyone else, find space inside and stay clear of the gates. The Hart brothers managed the livestock, herding confused cattle and horses into the reinforced pens built specifically for this purpose. Animals sensed danger in ways humans often missed. They were wild-eyed and difficult, fighting the direction, wanting to run anywhere but into an enclosed space. Robert Fletcher worked the water distribution, filling barrels and buckets, making sure everyone who arrived got something to drink after their journey. The heat was staggering, even worse than the preceding weeks, the air shimmering with it. Sarah Fletcher appeared with a wagon full of supplies from the general store. Food, blankets, medical supplies. She'd emptied half the store, loading everything that might be needed, and drove it here herself, her face set with determination. "Where do you want these?" she asked Jebediah, who stood near the archway, leaning heavily against the stone because his legs were threatening to give out. "Storage area, west wall. Robert knows where." He gestured weakly, and Sarah drove off without argument. Marcus Webb arrived with his family and 3 neighboring families crammed into 2 wagons. He stopped at the entrance, looking up at Jebediah with an expression that held shame and gratitude in equal measure. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About everything. Can we—" "Get inside," Jebediah interrupted. "We'll talk about apologies later. Right now, just get your people safe." The wagons rolled through the archway, and Marcus paused as he passed Jebediah. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being stubborn enough not to listen when we told you to stop." By noon, more than 150 people had crowded into the sanctuary. The space that had seemed enormous during construction now felt cramped. Bodies pressed together, children crying, animals making distressed noises from the holding pens. Dr. Morrison set up a medical station near the east wall, treating minor injuries from the rushed evacuation. A twisted ankle, a cut from loading wagons too quickly, an elderly woman who'd collapsed from heat exhaustion. He worked with calm efficiency, a lifetime of practice showing in every movement. The smoke on the horizon grew thicker, darker, closer. What had been a distant threat at dawn was an approaching reality by afternoon. People could smell it now, the acrid scent of burning forest, the chemical stench of structures consumed by flame. Jebediah climbed the ladder to the sanctuary wall, his body protesting every rung, his heart hammering in his chest, his vision swimming. But he needed to see, needed to know what was coming and how long they had. From the top of the wall, the view stole his breath. Fire covered the mountains to the north like a living thing, a wall of flame hundreds of feet high, moving with impossible speed. The sound of it reached him even at this distance, a roar like continuous thunder, punctuated by the crack of exploding trees. Thomas appeared beside him, breathing hard from the climb. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, "I've never seen anything like it." "That's because nothing like it happens in a human lifetime," Jebediah said. "This is what my grandfather saw in 1847, what my father saw in 1871, the fire that comes once in a generation and reshapes everything. How long do we have?" Jebediah studied the fire's movement, calculating speed and distance with skills honed over decades of observing weather patterns. 3 hours, maybe 4. It's moving faster than anything natural should move. The heat is creating its own wind system, feeding itself. Will the sanctuary hold? We're about to find out. Below them, more people continued to arrive, their numbers swelling past 200. These were people who'd mocked him, called him insane, signed petitions to have him declared incompetent. And now they pressed through his archway seeking salvation he'd spent 5 years building despite their opposition. He felt no satisfaction in being proven right, only exhaustion and a deep, aching hope that what he'd built would be enough. "We need to close the gates soon," Thomas said. "Once the fire gets close, we can't risk having them open." "Not yet. There are still people out there. I can see dust on the south road. Someone's coming fast." They watched as a wagon appeared, horses running flat out, driver cracking a whip over their backs. As it got closer, Jebediah recognized the driver, Pastor Williams, the man who'd testified against him at the guardianship hearing. The wagon was loaded with people, at least 15 crammed into a space meant for 6. He went back, Thomas said, understanding. He must have gone back for people who couldn't make it on their own. The wagon thundered through the archway, and Pastor Williams didn't even stop, just gestured for everyone to get out while he drove straight to the holding pens to free the horses. Jebediah started down the ladder, moving too fast for his failing body, nearly falling twice. When he reached the ground, Pastor Williams was there, his face blackened with soot, his eyes red from smoke. "There's more," the pastor gasped. "Families trapped on the East Ridge. The fire cut off their route. I couldn't get to them." "How many?" "Maybe 20, maybe more. They were heading for the old mining camp, thinking the rock would protect them." "It won't." Jebediah knew that area. No water, no real shelter. They'd be dead within an hour of the fire reaching them. "Which families?" Pastor Williams listed names, and Jebediah's heart sank. He knew these people. Had sold cattle to some of them, had attended church with others, had shared meals and conversations and the quiet fellowship of neighbors living side by side for decades. "We have to close the gates," Thomas said, appearing beside them. "Jeb, I'm sorry, but we can't wait any longer. The fire's too close." Jebediah looked at the approaching wall of flame, then at the sanctuary full of people who'd made it to safety, then back at the mountains where families huddled in inadequate shelter, waiting for a death that was coming whether they could see it yet or not. "Close them," he said, his voice breaking. "God forgive us, but close them." The gates swung closed with a finality that felt like death itself. Iron bars dropped into place. The stone archway that had welcomed so many now stood as a barrier between salvation and destruction. Inside the sanctuary, 247 people waited. Every space was occupied. Children pressed against parents. Elderly folks sat on the stone benches. Young men stood ready with buckets of water, though what good water would do against what was coming, nobody knew. The roar of the fire grew louder, no longer distant thunder, but an immediate presence that made conversation impossible without shouting. The temperature inside the sanctuary rose steadily. 95 degrees, 100, 105. People drenched themselves with water from the moat, desperate for any relief from the heat that would only get worse. Jebediah stood near the center of the main chamber, leaning on Robert for support, his body trembling with exhaustion and the certain knowledge that he was about to witness either his greatest accomplishment or his most catastrophic failure. The first wave of embers arrived like a storm of fireflies, thousands of them glowing orange and red, carried by winds the fire had created, falling from the sky in a deadly rain. They struck the stone walls harmlessly. They hit the sod-covered roof and smoldered briefly before dying out. They landed in the water moat and extinguished with small hisses. "It's working," Robert breathed. "The design is working." But Jebediah knew this was just the beginning. Embers were scouts. The real fire was still coming. It arrived 10 minutes later. The forest around the sanctuary exploded. Trees that had stood for centuries became torches in seconds. The underbrush vanished in a wave of flame that swept past the sanctuary's fire-break trenches like they were nothing. The heat became a physical force, pressing against the walls, seeking entry through any crack or weakness. Inside, people screamed. Children buried their faces in their parents' shoulders. Someone began praying loudly, their voice carrying over the roar, and others joined in. A desperate chorus asking for deliverance from fire that felt biblical in its intensity. The temperature spiked. 115, 120. People collapsed from heat exhaustion. Dr. Morrison worked frantically, trying to keep the most vulnerable alive, pouring water over them, trying to cool bodies that were cooking from ambient temperature alone. "The roof!" Thomas shouted, pointing upward. Smoke was seeping through the ventilation shafts, gray tendrils that thickened rapidly. The sod was burning despite the stone covering, despite the moisture they'd packed into it, despite every precaution they'd taken. Robert grabbed buckets and a team of men. They formed a chain, hauling water from the interior storage and throwing it upward, trying to cool the roof from inside. But the temperature kept rising. "We need to move to the underground chamber," Thomas said urgently to Jebediah. "We can't survive this heat much longer." Jebediah looked at the panicked crowd, at the children struggling to breathe, at the elderly who were already unconscious from the heat. Moving 247 people through a narrow opening into a space designed for perhaps 50 would cause chaos, panic, probably death from crushing even if the fire didn't kill them. But staying here meant certain death for everyone. "Start moving them," Jebediah said. "Families with children first, injured and elderly next. Everyone else follows in order. No pushing, no panic. Tell them there's room for everyone." "There isn't room for everyone." "Then we'll make room. Move." Thomas gathered the Hart brothers and began organizing the evacuation. The hidden chamber's entrance, once concealed, now exposed, gaped like a mouth at the far end of the sanctuary. People stared at it in confusion and wonder, not understanding how there could be anything below the stone floor they'd been standing on. "There's a chamber below," Robert shouted over the fire's roar. "Built by Jebediah's grandfather 80 years ago. Everyone moves down in order. Stay calm." The evacuation began with surprising organization. Fear was a powerful motivator, and people understood that panic would kill them faster than fire. Families descended the stone steps carved into the chamber entrance. The injured were lowered carefully. The elderly went slowly but steadily. Above them, the fortress walls were proving their worth. Flames washed over them like water, finding no purchase on the fitted stone. The fire-break trenches did their job, starving the flames of fuel even as embers continued to rain down. The water moat boiled in places, steam rising in great clouds, but it didn't dry up. The underground spring feeding it proved inexhaustible. Jebediah's design was working. The sanctuary was holding, but the heat continued to intensify. 130 degrees, 135, temperatures that shouldn't be survivable, that turned the air itself into a weapon. The roof timbers began to crack, loud reports that sounded like rifle shots. The stone would hold, but wood, even heavy redwood timbers, had limits. If the roof failed, nothing would protect them from the radiant heat of the firestorm above. "Everyone needs to be below ground in 5 minutes," Jebediah said to Thomas. "We don't have longer than that." The last of the families descended. The injured were all below. Dr. Morrison went down to continue treating them. The volunteers who'd helped build the sanctuary followed, then the ranchers, then everyone else until only a handful remained above. Thomas, Robert, the Hart brothers, Pastor Williams, and Jebediah. "Go," Jebediah told them. "I'll come last." "The hell you will," Thomas said. "We all go together, or none of us go." Another timber cracked, this one louder, more final. Smoke was so thick now that breathing required covering your mouth and nose with water-soaked cloth. The temperature had reached a point where Jebediah's measurements became meaningless. This was simply heat that killed, heat that destroyed, heat that shouldn't exist outside of industrial furnaces or volcanic vents. "Together, then," Jebediah said, and they descended into the earth, pulling the stone slab closed above them, sealing themselves in darkness and relative cool, while above, the world burned. They emerged 3 days later. The stone slab that sealed the underground chamber required 6 men to move it, their muscles straining against weight that seemed impossibly heavy after days in the darkness below. When it finally shifted and light flooded in, they stood blinking against brightness their eyes had forgotten, breathing air that smelled of ash and death but was blessedly cool. The sanctuary stood, blackened, scorched, the timbers of the roof reduced to charcoal, but the stone walls were intact. The water in the moat had dropped to a few inches, but the underground spring still flowed. The fire-break trenches had done their job. Beyond them, the forest was gone, reduced to ash and the skeletal remains of what had once been giant redwoods. But inside the perimeter, within the protection Jebediah had built, life had survived. 247 people climbed from the underground chamber into a world transformed. The valley they'd known was simply gone. Where green forests had stood, only ash remained. Where homes had dotted the landscape, nothing but stone foundations and blackened chimneys marked their existence. The town of Millstone was ash and memory, but they were alive. Jebediah Cole stood at the gate, the reinforced gate that had withstood temperatures hot enough to melt iron in places, and looked out at the devastation. He'd been right. He'd prepared. He'd saved them. But the weight of that responsibility didn't feel like triumph. It felt like grief for a world that had been beautiful and was now broken. Thomas Garrett found him there, standing alone, his body so frail now that he looked like he might blow away with the next wind. "You did it, Jeb," Thomas said quietly. "You saved us all." "Not all," Jebediah said. "The families on the East Ridge, the people who didn't believe in time, the ones who waited too long. You saved everyone you could save. That's all anyone can do." In the weeks that followed, the survivors began to rebuild. Not their old homes. There was nothing left to rebuild from, but new structures, incorporating the lessons Jebediah had taught them through 5 years of stubbornness and vision. Stone foundations, wide fire breaks, water systems designed to survive drought, communities built with survival in mind rather than just convenience. The sanctuary became the center of the new settlement. The town reformed around it, using it as a meeting hall, a storage facility, a school, and a church. The underground chamber remained a secret known only to those who'd sheltered there, but its existence was hinted at in stories told to children. A place of ultimate safety, built by wise men who understood that preparation required depth. Marcus Webb, humbled by events that had proven him spectacularly wrong, organized the reconstruction effort. He deferred to Jebediah on matters of fire safety, of building design, of long-term planning. The guardianship petition was forgotten, burned along with so much else that had seemed important before the fire taught them what actually mattered. Sarah Fletcher reopened her general store, salvaging what inventory had survived and ordering new supplies from Sacramento. Robert worked alongside his mother, but spent his evenings at the sanctuary, learning more from Jebediah, asking questions about patterns and cycles, absorbing knowledge that would need to be passed to the next generation. Dr. Morrison treated injuries and illnesses in a new clinic built of stone, his medical practice busier than ever, but his spirit lighter, grateful for every patient he could help because they'd all survived when they shouldn't have. Pastor Williams rebuilt his church using stone from the mountains and timber from forests beyond the fire's reach. His first sermon spoke of stubbornness and wisdom, of listening to voices that seemed mad until proven prophetic, of the importance of preparation over pride. And Jebediah Cole, 85 years old and feeling every day of it, sat on the sanctuary wall one evening in October, watching the sunset paint the scarred valley in shades of gold and red. Thomas joined him, as he often did these days, 2 old men who'd survived something remarkable through preparation and luck, in equal measure. "How do we make sure they remember?" Thomas asked. 20 years from now, 40 when the valley has healed and the scars have faded. How do we make sure they remember what happened here? Jebediah pulled out his grandfather's journal. Smoke damaged but intact. Same way my grandfather remembered. Same way my father remembered. We write it down, every detail, every pattern, every lesson learned, and we pass it to someone who will carry it forward. Robert, Jebediah agreed. He understands. He'll teach his children, and they'll teach theirs. The patterns will repeat. They always do. 45 to 55 years from now, this valley will face another fire. But if we've done our job, if we've passed on what we know, they'll be ready. He'd spent the past weeks carving an inscription into the stone archway. His hands, trembling with age and exhaustion, struggled with the work, but he refused help. This needed to be done by him, needed to carry the weight of personal testimony. The inscription read, "Built 1897-1902 by Jebediah Cole, who listened when others laughed. If you shelter here, remember, wisdom often looks like madness until it saves your life. Prepare for what's coming, not just what's here. The patterns repeat. Honor them." Thomas read it, his eyes growing bright. "Your grandfather would be proud. My grandfather was practical. Pride wasn't something he valued, but preparation, that he understood." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun finished setting and stars began to appear. Bright and clear in air, scrubbed clean by fire. The valley would heal, the forests would regrow, life would return, and in 50 years, someone would need to see the signs and prepare again, just as Jebediah had done, just as his grandfather and father had done before him. The cycle would continue, the patterns would repeat. And if the lessons were remembered, if the wisdom was passed down, if someone in that future generation had the courage to be called insane while building salvation, then survival would continue, generation after generation, protected by stone and water and the accumulated knowledge of those who'd learned to read the earth's long memory. Jebediah Cole died 3 months later in his sleep, in a small room he'd built adjacent to the sanctuary. He was 85 years old. He'd saved 247 people. He'd rebuilt a community. He'd passed on knowledge that would protect generations yet unborn. At his funeral, the entire valley attended. They stood before the sanctuary he'd built, reading the inscription he'd carved, understanding finally that what had seemed like madness was the deepest wisdom, the courage to prepare for disaster before it arrived, to build salvation before it was needed, to carry burdens alone until others were ready to believe. And when they lowered him into the ground, beside Margaret, beneath a sky that was clear and blue and promised nothing but tomorrow, the bell he'd hung rang out across the valley one final time, not as a warning, but as a farewell to a man who'd seen what others couldn't, believed what others wouldn't, and saved them all because he'd been too stubborn to quit even when the whole world called him insane.